My name is Elizabeth Sterling. I am 70 years old, and for the past year, my world has been a quiet and deeply lonely epilogue. My husband of 50 years, Arthur, is gone. For 40 of those years, I was a professor of classical literature. My life was a conversation with the dead, with the great and often tragic voices of the past. I taught Homer and Sophocles and Virgil. I understood the architecture of a tragedy, the slow, inexorable march of a character towards a fate that is both shocking and, in hindsight, utterly inevitable. I believed that the old stories, the ancient myths, were not just stories. They were blueprints of the human heart, schematics of our own, timeless and often fatal flaws. Arthur was a lawyer, a man of beautiful and precise logic. But he had a poet's soul. He understood my love for the old stories. Our life together was a long and beautiful conversation between the law and the literature, between logic and myth. We built a good life, a life of books, of travel, of a deep and abiding intellectual and emotional partnership. Our home, a large, comfortable Tudor-style house filled with his law books and my epic poems, was a testament to this partnership. Our only son, Marcus, was the one story we could never quite figure out how to write. He inherited his father's ambition, but none of his quiet integrity. He inherited my love for beauty, but none of my patience for the work required to understand it. He is a successful man, a partner at a large investment firm, but his success is a brittle and deeply anxious thing. He is a man who is terrified of falling, of failing, of not being seen as the powerful and important man he so desperately wants to be. He married Sophia, a woman who is a perfect and chilling reflection of his own deepest anxieties. She is beautiful, she is ambitious, and she is a woman who sees the world as a ladder. Every person, every relationship is either a rung to be stepped on or an obstacle to be kicked away. My great sacrifice, the final and most total act of my long life as a wife and a mother, was the last year of Arthur's life. He was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. The decline was swift, and it was brutal. The brilliant, logical, and powerful mind I had loved for half a century was trapped in a body that was slowly and cruelly betraying him. And I, in turn, sacrificed my own, nascent and deeply longed for, retirement. I had just retired from the university, my head full of plans for a final, great scholarly project, a new translation of the Odyssey. But I put it all away. I became his nurse, his companion, his memory, his 24/7 caregiver. My world, once a sprawling universe of literature and ideas, shrank to the dimensions of his sick room. Marcus and Sophia were, of course, devastated. They would visit, their faces arranged in masks of perfect, sorrowful concern. They would bring expensive and useless gifts from designer stores. They would speak in hushed, reverent tones. But their grief was a performance. I could see it in their eyes, a flicker of a cold and impatient calculation. They were not mourning the man who was dying. They were waiting for the end of the story and for the reading of the will. I, in my own profound and all-consuming grief, chose to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that they were simply afraid. It was the last and most foolish lie I would ever tell myself. Arthur died on a quiet, rainy Tuesday in March. The funeral was a grand and deeply impersonal affair, orchestrated and paid for by Marcus and Sophia. It was not a tribute to the man I had loved, the quiet, brilliant, and deeply kind man. It was a networking event, a public performance of their own, profound, and very well connected grief. In the days that followed, their concern for me was a suffocating and deeply, deeply false thing. They hovered. They made my tea. They spoke in soft, gentle, and utterly patronizing tones. They treated me not as a grieving widow, but as a fragile and slightly senile child. "You need to get away, Mother," Marcus had said, his voice a perfect, soothing balm of filial piety. "You need a change of scene, to rest, to heal." Sophia and I, he continued, we've arranged everything. We've booked you a flight to go and stay with your sister in Florida for a month. Just to get away from this house, from all the memories. We'll take care of everything here. Don't you worry about a thing. Don't you worry about a thing. I was so tired. The year of caregiving, the raw and gaping wound of my own grief. It had left me an empty shell, and their offer, their seeming kindness, was a siren song. To be taken care of, to not have to think. I agreed. I, who had spent a lifetime analyzing the fatal flaws of tragic heroes, had just, with a weary and grateful nod, walked willingly into my own personal Trojan horse. The day of my flight, they were a picture of loving, dutiful children. They packed my bag. They drove me to the airport. They walked me all the way to the security gate. We'll call you every day, Sophia said, her hug a brief and brittle thing. We love you, Mom, Marcus said, kissing my cheek. Just rest. We'll handle everything. And then they were gone. I walked through security. I found my gate. And I sat, a small, gray, and deeply lonely old woman in the vast, impersonal, and echoing terminal. My flight was in 2 hours. I sat there, and I tried to feel grateful. But a small, cold, and deeply unsettling feeling began to creep into my heart. A feeling of wrongness. The feeling of a classicist who has just read a line of Homer that has been subtly but crucially mistranslated. We'll handle everything. Why? What did that mean? What was everything? And then it hit me. A jolt of pure, cold, and absolute panic. The will. Arthur's will. It was still in the small fireproof safe in his study. The original, signed, and notarized document. We were supposed to have taken it to the lawyer's office together after the funeral. But in the chaos, in my grief, in their suffocating and very well managed concern, I had forgotten. And they, it seemed, had not reminded me. It was, I told myself, a simple oversight, an accident. But the feeling of wrongness, the feeling of a deeply and expertly crafted narrative that I was not the author of, grew stronger. I am not a hysterical woman. I am a scholar. And a scholar, when faced with a textual anomaly, goes back to the primary source. I did not get on the plane. I told the gate agent I was feeling unwell. I walked out of the terminal, my small carry-on bag in my hand. I did not call my son. I did not want him to know I was not on that plane. I took a taxi, not to my home, but to a small, quiet hotel near my house. I checked in under a false name. And then I waited. I waited until I knew they would be out, at a dinner they had mentioned, a dinner to thank their friends for their support. That evening, under the cover of a cold and drizzling rain, I took a taxi to my own street. I had the driver drop me at the corner. And I walked, a ghost in the rainy suburban night, to my own dark and silent house. I let myself in with the key I always kept hidden under a loose stone in the garden, a secret that was mine alone. The house was cold. It was silent. It was empty. But it did not feel right. There was a sense of a presence, of a story that had been unfolding in my absence. I walked, my feet silent on the thick Persian rugs, to the study. The door was ajar. And I heard them. Their voices. Marcus and Sophia. They had not gone out to dinner. They were here, in the heart of my home. And they were talking. I stood in the dark hallway, my heart a cold and hammering drum against my ribs. And I listened. The flight took off an hour ago, my son, Marcus was saying, his voice a low and deeply, deeply satisfied purr. She's gone. Finally, stage 1 is complete, and she didn't suspect a thing. Sophia's voice, a sharp and glittering and utterly reptilian sound. She didn't ask any more questions about the will? Not a word, Marcus said with a low chuckle. She was like a child, so grateful, so tired, it was almost too easy. Good, Sophia said. So, tomorrow morning, you call the lawyer. You tell him that your mother is too distraught to handle her own affairs. You invoke the power of attorney she signed last year. And then we find the best and quickest long-term care facility. A place with good security. A place where she can be kept, quiet. Once she's settled, we sell the house. We sell the stocks. We liquidate everything. And then we are finally free. Renorson. Tito be kept quiet. Rain. Trevor. The words, the plan, the cold and casual and deeply, deeply evil. A conspiracy they were discussing in the very room where my husband had died, in the very house where I had raised my son. The scholar in me, the woman who had studied the great and terrible tragedies of the human heart, was not shocked. She was, in a strange and terrible way, almost satisfied. The text had revealed its true and monstrous meaning. The fatal flaw of the hero, my son, had been revealed. And the story was now, finally, and inexorably hurtling towards its tragic and deeply, deeply just conclusion. I stood in the cold, dark hallway, a ghost in my own home, and I listened to the sound of my own life being dismantled. The initial shock, the hot, searing pain of the betrayal, was quickly replaced by a strange and profound and deeply chilling sense of calm. I was not a wife anymore. I was not a mother. I was a character in a Greek tragedy, a woman who had just overheard the prophecy of her own doom. And I knew, with the absolute and unshakable certainty of a scholar who has read this story 1,000 times before, that my role was not to weep, or to rage, or to plead with the gods. My role was to act. They thought I was Hecuba, a weeping, helpless, and dethroned queen, to be pitied and then discarded. They had no idea that I was, in fact, Medea, a woman who, when pushed to the absolute and final limit, was capable of a righteous and terrifying and beautifully, brutally just retribution. The love I had for my son, a love that had been a vast and warm and life-giving ocean, flash froze in that moment. It became a glacier, a slow-moving and unstoppable force of pure, cold, and destructive power. I was no longer grieving the loss of my husband. I was mourning the loss of my son, a boy who had died long ago and who had been replaced by this monstrous and unrecognizable stranger. My mind, the mind of a classicist, a mind trained to see the deep, underlying, and often ironic patterns of fate, began to work. Arthur Ein, my husband, the brilliant and quiet and deeply perceptive man. He had known. He had seen the fatal flaw in our son's character. He had seen the reptilian ambition in Sophia's eyes. And he had, in his own quiet and deeply loving way, prepared for this. He had written a better ending to the story. The very special circumstances. That is what our lawyer, Mr. Henderson, had said to me a week before Arthur's death, a day I could barely remember through the thick gray fog of my grief. Arthur had summoned him to his bedside. I had been in the room, but my mind had been elsewhere. Your husband has amended his will, Elizabeth, Henderson had said, his voice full of a gentle and slightly pitying sadness. The main body of it remains the same, but he has added a codicil, a final, sealed instruction. He has left a letter with me to be opened by you, and only you, but only under very special circumstances. He was most insistent on that point. At the time, I had assumed it was a final romantic gesture. A last love letter, perhaps. A final, sentimental epilogue. I now understood. It was not an epilogue. It was a failsafe. It was a prophecy. And it was a weapon. My decision was not a decision. It was a fulfillment of my husband's final and most brilliant legal and literary design. I would not confront them. I would not reveal my presence. That would be to stoop to their level of messy, emotional, and ultimately unproductive drama. No, my response would be a thing of beauty, a thing of order, a thing of pure and irrefutable textual authority. I backed away from the study door, my movements as silent as a ghost's. I did not go to the safe to retrieve the will they knew about. That document was now a fiction, a red herring in the true, and much more interesting, story that was about to unfold. I retreated from the house, back into the cold, drizzling rain of the night. I was no longer a homeless refugee. I was a general, leaving the battlefield to retrieve a secret and much more powerful weapon. I returned to my anonymous hotel room, and I made a phone call. Not to the police, not to my son, but to Mr. Henderson, my lawyer. I woke him from a deep sleep. "Henderson," I said, and my voice was not the voice of the grieving, broken widow he had last spoken to. It was the voice of Elizabeth Sterling, the professor, the scholar, the woman who was, once again, in command. "It is Elizabeth. The very special circumstances my husband spoke of, they have come to pass. I need you to bring me his final letter, now." Mr. Henderson, a man who had known my husband for 40 years, a man who had seen the cold, calculating ambition in my son's eyes, did not ask any questions. He simply said, "I will be there in an hour." He arrived at my hotel room at 1 in the morning, his old kind face a mask of a grave and deeply respectful concern. He was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a heavy wax seal bearing my husband's family crest. He handed it to me. "Arthur made me promise," he said, his voice a low, sad rumble. "He said you would know when the time was right, and he said he was sorry that he had to leave you with one final and difficult task." I took the envelope. My hands were perfectly steady. "He was a good man, Henderson," I said, "and a very, very clever writer." After he left, I sat in the quiet, anonymous silence of the hotel room, and I broke the seal. Inside was not a letter. Not at first. There was a small, black USB drive, a single, heavy, and ornate, antique key, and a small, folded note in my husband's familiar, elegant, and now heartbreakingly final script. It read, "My dearest Elizabeth, if you are reading this, then my greatest fear has come to pass. And for that, I am more sorry than words can ever say. I am sorry for the son we raised, for the man he has become. I saw the weakness in him, the greed, the moral hollowness, and I did not know how to fix it. I have failed him. And in doing so, I have failed you. But I will not fail you in this, my final act. I will not leave you to the mercy of his and her ambition. No. A USB drive contains a video, a final and legally binding testamentary statement. It is my true and final will. The key opens a small hidden safe behind the false bookshelf to the right of the fireplace in my study. Inside that safe is the original, signed, and notarized copy of this new will. The will you have, the one in the main safe, is a decoy, a fiction. I wrote it to give them a sense of security, to allow them to reveal their true natures, without fear of consequence. I am sorry to have put you through this, my love. It is a terrible and cruel final act of a play. But I knew that you, my brilliant and strong Elizabeth, the woman who has always understood the structure of a tragedy, would know how and when to bring down the final curtain. Do what you must. Be the just and righteous goddess you have always been. And then, live. Live the life you so richly deserve. When you enter, all my love, for all time. Arthur. I did not weep. The time for tears was over. I held his final, beautiful, and deeply, deeply loving words in my hand, and I felt a surge of strength I thought I had lost forever. He had not left me alone. He had left me a plan, a script, and a weapon. The will reading was scheduled for the next morning at Mr. Henderson's office. Marcus and Sophia had, of course, insisted on it being held as soon as possible. They were in a hurry to begin their new and much wealthier lives. I arrived at the office, not as the grieving widow they expected, but as the executor of my husband's true and final wishes. I was dressed in a simple but severe black dress. I was not in mourning. I was a judge in her robes. They were already there, sitting across the vast, polished mahogany table from my empty chair. They were a picture of sober and deeply fraudulent sorrow. Sophia was dabbing at her dry eyes with a black-laced handkerchief. Marcus was staring at the table, his face a mask of a grave and deeply respectful grief. "Mother," he said, his voice a low and perfectly modulated murmur. "I am so glad you could make it. I know how hard this must be for you." "I am fine, Marcus," I said, my voice as cold and as clear as the winter morning outside. Mr. Henderson began. He read the first will, the decoy will, the one that they knew about. The one that split the entire multi-million-dollar estate, down the middle, 50-50, between myself and my beloved son, Marcus Deche. As the final words were read, Sophia let out a small and perfectly timed sob. Marcus reached over and patted her hand, a gesture of shared and deeply anticipated victory. And then I spoke. "That is a beautiful story, Henderson," I said, my voice quiet, but cutting through the hushed, reverent silence of the room. "A lovely piece of fiction, but I'm afraid my husband, in his final days, decided to write a new and much more interesting final chapter." I placed the small black USB drive on the polished table. "This," I announced, "is my husband's final and true last will and testament, a video addendum, and I believe we should all watch it together." Mr. Henderson, who had been a co-conspirator in my husband's beautiful and tragic final play, did not feign surprise. He simply gave a slow, grave nod. "Of course, Elizabeth," he said. "The codicil." He rose, and with the solemnity of a priest, he slid the USB drive into the laptop at the head of the conference table. He connected the laptop to the large flat-screen monitor on the wall, a monitor that was usually used for displaying complex financial charts. Marcus and Sophia stared at the small, black, plastic object as if it were a bomb. And in a way, it was. "What is this?" Marcus demanded, his voice a mixture of confusion and a dawning, ugly suspicion. "Mother, what are you doing?" "The will has been read. The first draft has been read, Marcus," I replied, my voice as calm and as cold as the marble of a Greek statue. But Arthur, as you know, was a meticulous editor. He believed in the importance of a final and definitive revision. The screen flickered to life, and there he was. My husband, Arthur Dede. He was not the strong, vital man I had loved. He was a ghost, a pale and terribly thin echo of his former self, propped up in his hospital bed. But his eyes were as clear, as intelligent, and as full of a sad and profound love as they had ever been. The video was time-stamped. It had been filmed 2 days before he died. "Hello, everyone," he began, his voice weak but steady and carrying the unmistakable and deeply familiar authority of the law at Cray. "If you are watching this, it means I am gone, and it means that my dear wife, Elizabeth, has found herself in the very special circumstances I had feared." Injakan, Marcus and Sophia were frozen, their faces a mask of pure and dawning horror. This was not a sentimental farewell. This was a testimony, a witness, speaking from beyond the grave. "I am speaking to you now," Arthur continued, his eyes seeming to stare directly, and with a profound and heartbreaking sorrow, at his own son, because I know my own fatal flaw. "It is you, Marcus. I loved you too much. I gave you too much. I gave you too much. I gave you too much. And in doing so, I failed to teach you the one and most important lesson. That'll..." He took a slow, rattling breath. "I have known, for some time," he said, his voice now a low and damning whisper, "You've your ambitions, of your and Sophia's plans for your mother's future, of your desire to be unburdened. I have seen the way you look at her, not as a mother but as an obstacle,
a temporary and increasingly inconvenient obstacle on your path to the life you feel you deserve.
Sophia let out a small, strangled gasp. Marcus was as white as a sheet. And so, Arthur said, a look of immense and weary sadness on his face, I was forced, in my final days, to make a choice between the son I love and the wife I have loved and respected and admired for 50 years. A choice between my flawed and beloved creation and my perfect and unwavering partner. Ah, no. He looked directly into the camera then, and his eyes, for a moment, seemed to find mine, across the void of time and death. And I have chosen her. Hey, will you have just heard Reed, he announced, his voice now ringing with the cold, clear finality of a judge delivering a verdict. Yes, a fiction. A decoy. I wrote it to give you the rope, Marcus. The rope with which to hang your own, greedy and treacherous soul. The true last will and testament of Arthur Sterling is located in a hidden safe in my study, the key to which I have left in the care of my wife. He held up a single, ornate, antique key. Elizabeth, my love, he said, his voice now softening, becoming the voice of the man I had loved. If you are watching this, it means they have done what I feared. Now, you must do what I asked. Be the just and righteous goddess you have always been. End this story, and then, please, begin your own. Goddess, begin your own. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in that room was a living and a terrible thing. It was the silence of a tomb, of a courtroom after a verdict of guilty has been read. Marcus and Sophia were not just defeated. They were annihilated. They had been judged and condemned by a ghost, by the very man whose death they had been so impatiently and so greedily awaiting. I did not speak. I simply and quietly placed the heavy, ornate key on the polished mahogany table. Mr. Henderson, his face a mask of a grave and deeply satisfying sorrow, cleared his throat. Well, he said, it seems we have one final document to retrieve. The collapse was total. They did not shout. They did not protest. They were broken. We retrieved the final will. It was a simple and beautiful and utterly ruthless document. It disinherited my son, Marcus, completely and totally, citing his profound and demonstrated lack of filial piety and basic human decency. And it left the entire and very substantial Sterling estate to me, solely and without condition. The goddess, it seemed, had just been handed her thunderbolts. My old life ended that day, in the quiet and deeply haunted aftermath of my husband's final, brilliant and heartbreaking legal maneuver. My new life began the next morning with the quiet, satisfying act of opening a book I had not touched in a year. The divorce from my own son was a quiet and deeply sad affair. I did not disown him in a fit of rage. I simply released him. I gave him a small and final severance package, enough for him and Sophia to start a new life somewhere else, a life that was, for the first time, entirely and completely their own to find. They took the money, and they disappeared. Their story, for me, was over. They were a sad and poorly written book that I had finally and irrevocably placed back on the shelf. I sold the large, Tudor-style house. It was not a home anymore. It was a crime scene, a stage for a tragedy, and it was full of ghosts. And with the considerable, and now unburdened, fortune that Arthur had so cleverly and so lovingly protected for me, I did not buy another house. I did not travel the world. I did the one thing that the old and the new Elizabeth had always and truly wanted to do. I went back to the story. I established the Arthur Sterling Memorial Press. It is not a large commercial publishing house. It is a small, independent, and deeply, deeply nerdy nonprofit press. We have one simple and beautiful mission: to publish new and brilliant translations of the classical texts that Arthur and I had loved. We find the best and often the most overlooked scholars in the world. And we give them the one thing that a scholar needs most: time and resources to do their work. We are in the business of preserving the great and timeless stories. My home is now a beautiful, light-filled apartment in a quiet university town, a place that smells of old books and new ideas. And my life is, once again, a conversation with the dead. My great and final scholarly project, the new annotated translation of the Odyssey, is finally underway. My days are filled with the quiet and deeply satisfying work of wrestling with the beautiful and often infuriating complexities of ancient Greek. The press is my new legacy. It is a testament not to my own, but to Arthur's profound and final act of love. He was a lawyer, a man of facts and of logic. But in the end, he understood the power of a story. He understood that the greatest and most enduring legacy one can leave is not a fortune, but a well-told tale. This evening, I am sitting in my study, the galleys of our first publication, a brilliant new translation of the Odyssey, spread across my desk. The story, with its themes of betrayal, of justice, of the terrible and often beautiful consequences of our own human flaws, feels more real and more relevant to me than ever. I learned, in the quiet and terrible crucible of my own personal tragedy, a profound and simple truth. We are all characters in a story whose ending we cannot always control. But if we are brave, if we are wise, and if we are very, very lucky, we are given the chance not to rewrite the past, but to write a new and better and much, much truer final chapter for ourselves. My husband, in his final and most loving act, did not just leave me a fortune. He left me a pen. And I am, finally and joyfully, writing my own story.